They never heard the footsteps. 8 people asleep in a quiet Iowa farmhouse. By morning, every single one of them would be dead, their skulls crushed by an axe. And the killer vanished into the night. Villisca, Iowa, was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else. A farming community in 1912, where gossip spread faster than the trains that passed through. Families left their doors unlocked, neighbors trusted one another, and nothing truly terrible ever seemed to happen there, at least not until that June night. The Moore family lived in a modest white 2-story home. Josiah Moore, 43, was a respected businessman and churchgoer. His wife, Sarah, 39, devoted her life to her family and the church as well. Together, they were raising 4 children: Herman, 11, Catherine, 10, Boyd, 7, and little Paul, only 5. They were the picture of a small-town American family, hard-working, religious, well-liked. On Sunday, June 9th, 1912, the family attended a special church service. Sarah had helped organize the annual Children's Day program, and the Moore children all took part in recitations and songs. The event ran late, and the Moores didn't head home until after 9:30 that night. They weren't alone. 2 young girls, Lena and Ina Stillinger, friends of Catherine, were invited for a sleepover. By 10 p.m., 8 souls settled into the house on East 2nd Street, unaware that none of them would ever wake again. Sometime after midnight, a stranger slipped inside. The killer was careful, silent. He picked up Josiah's own axe, which had been left outside in the yard, and carried it into the house. What happened next was brutal beyond comprehension. Josiah was the first to die. He was struck so violently in the head that his skull split open. His wife Sarah was next, killed in the same way as she lay beside him. The murderer then moved to the children's room, methodically bludgeoning each of the 4 more children. Catherine, Boyd, Paul, and Herman. None were spared. But the horror didn't end there. Downstairs, Lena and Ina Stillinger slept in the guest room. The killer crept into the room and attacked them with the same merciless force. Later reports suggested Lena may have awakened. Her body showed signs she had fought back. A defensive wound on her arm. Her position slightly shifted, as though she had tried to escape. It didn't matter. Both girls were killed. By dawn, the house was silent. Windows drawn. Doors locked from the inside. 8 lives extinguished in just a few hours. The next morning, neighbors noticed something strange. The usually active Moore house was still and quiet. No children playing, no sounds of chores being done. By 8 a.m., Josiah's brother Ross stopped by. He knocked on the door. No answer. He tried again. Nothing. Finally, he used his spare key and stepped inside. What he found would haunt him forever. The house was dark, curtains drawn tight. Every mirror had been covered with cloth. Pieces of clothing were draped over the glass, as though the killer couldn't bear to see his own reflection. The first sight of the bodies made Ross stagger backward. He ran from the house, shouting for help. Word spread quickly. Soon, the little town of Villisca was swarming with curious onlookers. People poured through the Moore house before the authorities even had a chance to rope it off. Dozens trampled through the crime scene, contaminating it beyond repair. Some even took fragments of Josiah's skull as gruesome souvenirs. By the time law enforcement tried to take control, the evidence was a disaster. The only thing certain was the brutality of the killings. Every victim had been struck with the blunt end of the axe, faces unrecognizable. In Josiah's case, the blows were so savage that gouge marks scarred the ceiling above his bed. Whoever the killer was, he was fueled by hatred or madness. The crime shocked Villisca. This was not a place where murders happened, let alone an entire family slaughtered in their own beds. The town's sense of safety shattered overnight. Doors were locked. neighbors eyed each other with suspicion, and rumors began to swirl about who could have committed such an atrocity. The Villisca Axe Murders had just begun to etch themselves into history, but the questions would never truly be answered. The investigation began almost immediately, but it was chaos from the start. With the crime scene trampled by neighbors and curiosity seekers, much of the physical evidence was ruined before police could even arrive. Even so, what remained was deeply unsettling. The killer had covered the victims' faces with sheets or clothing after striking them, as though ashamed of his own brutality. A bowl of water sat on the kitchen table, streaked with blood, suggesting the murderer had calmly washed his hands before leaving. And chillingly, strips of bacon were found in the house, one in the icebox and another left on the floor, wrapped in a towel. Why the killer did this remains one of the strangest details of the case. At first, suspicion fell on a traveling preacher named Reverend George Kelly. He had attended the same Children's Day program as the Moore family on the night of the murders, and witnesses recalled his odd behavior. He left town by train early that morning, just hours after the killings. Years later, Kelly even confessed to the crime during an interrogation. But he quickly recanted, and his confession was riddled with inconsistencies. Despite being tried twice, he was ultimately acquitted. Others suspected a rival businessman, Frank Jones. Josiah Moore had once worked for him but left on bad terms, taking valuable business with him. Some believed resentment festered into hatred. Rumors even suggested Josiah may have had an affair with Jones's daughter-in-law. But despite whispers and speculation, no solid evidence ever tied Jones to the crime. Another theory focused on a serial killer who traveled by train. In the early 1900s, the Midwest was plagued by a string of axe murders eerily similar to Villisca. Families slaughtered in their sleep, train tracks always nearby. Some investigators linked Villisca to these other crimes, believing the same drifter may have hopped off a passing train, killed the Moores, and vanished without a trace. Yet, no matter how many suspects emerged, the case refused to resolve. Witnesses contradicted each other, evidence was missing or contaminated, and the small-town police force was overwhelmed by the scale of the crime. In time, the investigation stalled. No one was ever convicted, no justice was ever found. The Villisca Axe Murders became less a case and more a legend, a ghost story whispered about in Iowa and beyond. The Moore house still stands today. Preserved as a grim reminder of that night, it has become a destination for tourists, paranormal investigators, and true crime enthusiasts. Visitors claim to hear footsteps in empty rooms. Doors creak open by themselves. Some say the voices of children echo faintly through the halls. Whether haunted by spirits or simply by memory, the house refuses to let the murders be forgotten. Over a century later, the Villisca Axe Murders remain one of America's most chilling unsolved crimes. 8 innocent lives taken, an entire town forever scarred, and a killer who slipped into the shadows without leaving a trace. Perhaps the most haunting part of all is knowing that whoever held that axe walked away into the night and was never found. If this mystery gripped you, there are many more stories waiting. Subscribe to Truth Uncovered and tell me in the comments, what do you think really happened inside the Moore house?